Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, excellencies, dear colleagues, my name is Andris Spruts. I'm director of Latvian Institute of International Affairs. And today I have a great pleasure to welcome all of you in our annual discussion on NATO security developments, also here in the region, Baltic Sea region. It is also an event which is annual one, as I said previously, and it takes place before we will have a NATO summit shortly. NATO has proved its relevance in general. It's also proved its relevance here in the Baltic region. Region remains relatively stable and safe as reassurance. Solidarity, deterrence measures have played an important role. Certainly we've seen also concrete steps here in the region. Most of allies are involved in the enhanced forward presence. We also realize the importance of own contributions. So the principle of one for all and for all for one. At the same time, let's be realistic. The questions appear about the like-mindedness of the transatlantic community of the like-minded. Dynamics within the alliance especially will be influenced by the role of indispensable nation of the United States. We have witnessed a quite historic handshake in Singapore, but we have seen less historic summit in Quebec among allies. And some of those allies will meet again quite shortly in Brussels. Western-Russian relations remain fragile and precarious. We see sort of new normal, but the new normal is not necessarily quite safe. Transparency of intentions, transparency of capabilities must be still further enhanced, including in the region. NATO member states are in a continuous search for balance between deterrence and dialogue in our relations with Russia. So we will discuss those issues on NATO developments, on NATO-Russia relations, on Baltic Sea region security today. But before discussion starts, we are very delighted and honored to have Latvian President Raimonds Vejonis as a keynote speaker at the opening of the conference. Mr. President, we are even more delighted because you honored us today on your birthday. This is an excellent occasion. We organized it for you today. And just sort of on a curious note, yesterday it was the birthday of Mr. Trump and Mr. Che Guevara as well. So yesterday it was a revolutionary day. Today I see that we have birthday of Mr. President Raimonds Vejonis and also a Chinese president, Mr. Xi. So it's interesting to observe how different dates are, you can say, moving one after another. So once more, Mr. President, happy birthday to you, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good morning, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. We have come to talk about existing and emerging challenges and the limits of opportunities of our responses. It is important to face facts. The challenges are all too clear. On our southern flank, there is conflict in the Middle East and instability in North Africa. The use of chemical weapons against civilians horrifies us all. To the east, resurgent Russia is flexing her military muscles and disinformation warfare and disinformation capabilities. Military aggression against Georgia in 2008 and Ukraine in 2014 show that Russia wants to undermine existing agreements and conventions in order to weaken the international rules-based order. In the Far East, China, and Mr. Strout mentioned that today China's president also have birthday. China is growing in importance. Her huge economic and military power is beginning to be felt internationally. We all hope for a peaceful solution to the North Korean nuclear weapon issue, but I think that is still far from certain. The world in general, and what we call the West in particular, is facing a growing terrorism problem. Added to this is the issue of migration, a challenge which is sure to increase with the effects of global warming. Perhaps even more serious is the challenge our democratic systems face. This comes not only from external interference in free and fair elections. Its root cause is a lack of trust in the political class and those in positions of authority. This is multiplied by the social media bubbles in which most of us live. In this environment, populist political parties thrive. Believe and trust in the values which have guided us since the Enlightenment are under threat. The unity of the West is undermined by the possibility of tariff wars and disagreements over such different issues as the Paris Climate Accord and the Iran nuclear deal. So, what should we do? I have already outlined some of the limitations on our action, but let us also touch on positive things. In terms of hard security, NATO remains the most successful alliance in history. NATO's EFP has added substance to the words of deterrence, and of course President Trump, who also had a birthday yesterday, has endorsed Article 5. At the Brussels summit, we hope to enhance EFP with an air and sea and reinforcement credibility it still lacks. Europe has begun to realize that we must pull our weight in defense without always relying on America. This means both together and as individual partners, like individual countries. President Macron has proposed a new European interventional force to add these to PESCO. There is a growing recognition on both sides of the Atlantic, and we need to look beyond our borders in order to guarantee our own security. Soft security is the area where the EU is placing the most emphasis. The European agenda on security for the next 5 years prioritizes terrorism, organized crimes, and cybercrime as areas where EU action can make a real difference. The threats posed by hybrid attacks are increasingly recognized. Countermeasures are being developed. It is clear that the use of little green men will not work again. We know what they are and therefore how to deal with them. Then there is fake news and information warfare, but people do not like to be deceived, not in person nor in are on social media. The deception called alternative facts must be resisted. Therefore, the importance of Stratcom and the Riga Center of Excellence is again underlined. We are really lucky that we have NATO Stratcom Center of Excellence here in Riga. There is also a growing recognition that deterrence can apply to hybrid threats. For instance, with elections, the more we prepare to prevent interference, the greater the costs to hostile actors with less likelihood of their success. Deterrence against hybrid threats is an area where opportunities should be sought. And I think it's too long we have been reactive. Now it is time to take actions. Finally, let us remember that we are in a battle for the hearts and minds. That is the hearts and minds of our own populations first. Those who envy our success and unity are trying to divide us. We must remain faithful to our shared values and principles, and I think it is time to wake up, to be more proactive, and most of all, to stay united. Especially for European Union, we must be united. And I hope that you will enjoy this conference and discussions during the conference and will bring home new ideas what we can do together for the strengthening our relations, for the strengthening security situation, not only here in the Baltics, not only in Europe, but in the whole world. Thanks.
Mr. President, thank you so much for wishes of good discussion. Also, thank you for the comprehensive insights. You certainly indicated that we live in quite complex world with a lot of challenges, but at the same time, there are solutions. One level of solutions, of course, is at home, so security basically starts at home. But at the same time, of course, collective effort within the alliance is also very important. And this event, as activities of NATO shows that partnerships are very important. Also, this time we have excellent partnerships with NATO, with two embassies, Polish embassy and Canadian embassy, and also with Friedrich Ebert Stiftung. So I'm happy to give the floor to Evelina Brudnicka, who is the charge of affairs at Polish embassy. So you have the, the difficult task, challenging task to represent two embassies almost at the same time. Please. Yes.
Your Excellency, Mr. President, Excellencies, distinguished guests, dear friends. The Embassy of Poland in Riga has the privilege to co-organize this annual public discussion on security already for the third time. Thank you, dear partners, for making it happen once again. And thank you, Mr. President, for doing us this honor of opening this debate on a special day. Brussels Summit will be the fourth high-level event marking important milestones in NATO adaptation to new security environment. After Newport, Warsaw, and the last mini-summit in Brussels, this year's meeting will be full of symbolism, but also of key decisions. This will be a summit of consequence, of consolidation and continuity. I bet no one in this room will deny that this is extremely important for countries in this region. Our common past and common experience taught us hard lessons about the cost of not standing up to aggression, the cost of not standing up to violation of international law, and the cost of not being ready to defend what is ours. Today, as we host NATO soldiers on our soil, NATO soldiers who are present also with us today, we can feel a bit safer. At the same time, being here in Riga, but also in Tallinn, Vilnius, Bucharest, or Warsaw, we are particularly aware of instability around us. Before the summit happens, it is important for all of us to realize that the security situation in our region will never be the same. The changes that occurred following the annexation of Crimea and ensuing aggression in Ukraine destroyed something very precious and fragile. It is something that will take very long time to deal with. That is why NATO must continue down the path of adaptation. As the security situation deteriorates, we must work hard together to address all threats and all challenges, regardless of where they come from. In this vein, we must make sure that in July, we show once again that we are united. This is what NATO is all about. NATO changed along with the changing nature of international politics during the Cold War. Once it ended, the alliance changed once more, opening up to members in our region. And so we must continue our change, our transformation today amid growing instability. That is why we need to think about consolidating achievements we made in adapting the alliance in Newport and Warsaw, making sure that we address such challenges as mobility, responsiveness, resilience, and border sharing, making sure that we are able to respond to novel challenges like hybrid warfare or cyber threats, and do it in a fast, effective manner. As we adapt, we cannot forget about security and prosperity in our neighborhood. We should highlight the importance of projecting stability both east and south of the alliance. Our partners in the east and south all live in an unstable gray security environment, and they all required our assistance. We know the cost of being in a gray zone. We know the consequences. That is why offering an open door to those partners that are willing and able to join our community is so important. Last but not least, we need to think about how to incorporate all of these issues into NATO-EU cooperation and take advantage, where possible, of synergies offered by these two organizations. If having said that, I just echoed what Mr. President had said, it only means that it was really worth stressing, and I wish you all engrossing discussion.
Thank you, Madam Brudnicka. Thank you for our partnership with Polish Embassy, with Canadian Embassy, and of course, once more, I can express my appreciation for Canadian and Polish troops and other nations being here. Certainly, it makes us to feel much more secure and stable here in the region. But with this, I'm happy to give the floor to another good, excellent partner, Tobias Marshall, who is representative head of the Baltic office of the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung. Tobias, the floor is yours, please.
Mr. President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, good morning from my side. It's a great pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the Friedrich Ebert Foundation to this excellent conference today. As so many questions have already been raised, I can be very, very short and we can start with the discussions. And so I'm lucky that we have the possibility to join the discussion. Maybe some words about our foundation, which is named after Friedrich Ebert, the first president of Germany, the first democratically elected president of Germany. Our foundation is named after him and is more or less his legacy. And we have two central aims, and they fit really perfect in our today's conference. The one is to promote democracy and strengthen civil society, but the other is to foster international understanding and cooperation, and thereby it's our central concern to work and strengthen the European cohesion. The future of NATO is at the heart of our today's conference, and to me personally, the future of NATO and the current security architecture seems more uncertain than ever after the last events in Canada and Singapore. Our security is based on multilateralism, reliability, and trust. and all are at the risk at the moment. Our current security architecture must undergo a thorough review. What are the strengths, the weaknesses, the challenges, and the threats? Europe and the NATO need a common vision of its security architecture, and at the moment, we rather have fragmented regional security visions, and it all doesn't fit together. And we need more trust, and we need more reliability. And I think our today's conference is an excellent occasion to discuss these limits and opportunities, responding to the existing and emerging challenges. And unfortunately, I've at the moment rather the impression that the challenges are becoming more and more by every day. So maybe sorry for being that pessimistic, but I'm quite sure that our panelists now will give us a more hopeful and differentiated vision of what's going to happen in the future. So thanks to all the panelists for joining this conference. Thanks for all you coming to this conference. And I'm looking forward for the debate and wish us all new insights, also some, well, good visions, what's going to be in the future, and not being that pessimistic about the future of NATO and of our common security. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Marshall, for your pessimism. I think it's a good start to have a good discussion. But once more, thank you for your partnership, long-standing partnership. We've been cooperating with Friedrich Ebert Stiftung for years, and we really highly appreciate it. So thank you once more to the Mr. President, to the partners for being part of this event, and we are looking forward to have a good and dynamic discussion. And with this, I am happy to give the floor to next panels or opening panels moderator Māris Anģēns, who is a senior fellow at the Latvian Institute of International Affairs and also assistant professor at Riga University. Māris, the floor is yours also to invite your panelists for a discussion, please.
Yes, good morning, dear ladies and gentlemen, both those who are here in the Dome Square and the old city of Riga, and also those who are watching us online on the internet portal Delphi LV. And yes, my name is Māris Anģēns. I'm honored to be the moderator for the first panel of the discussion, which is called NATO and Russia, Effectiveness and Limits of Deterrence and Dialogue. So since the end of the Cold War, there have been many ups and downs in the relationship between Russia and the West in general and NATO in particular. So we have had quite meaningful dialogue and also practical cooperation, but also quite many complications. And then these, so to say, positive moments have been interrupted by shorter or longer periods of misunderstandings and divergences of opinions. And of course, the latest and the most serious has been Ukraine, which has been mentioned on so many occasions. And since 2014, terms such as post-Crimea and the new normal have been so often used to describe the current situation, but it's quite clear that the new normal is not new anymore. It's already some 4 years, and it's quite clear that this is only a matter of time that the relationship will evolve in some direction. And today we will try to provide at least some answers and some versions on how things look like in Latvia, Poland, Canada, and also Russia, and how the situation could evolve. And therefore, I'm very happy to introduce you to the speakers of the panel. So first, from my left, we have Mr. Jānis Kažociņš, who is the National Security Advisor to the President of Latvia, Mr. Vējonis, and he is well known for his activities and expertise in his current capacity, and also previously as the Director of the Constitution Protection Bureau. But what is quite often forgotten is that Mr. Kažociņš had a quite successful career in British Armed Forces, and he retired at the rank of Brigadier General. So welcome, Mr. Kaczorowicz. Then we have Mr. Boguslav Vinid from Poland, who is also advisor to the president, but the president of Poland, Mr. Andrzej Duda. And he is advisor for foreign policy. And he has also had quite a rich background. He has served in leading positions, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Ministry of Defense, and also has been ambassador of Poland to NATO and the United Nations. And also important to mention that he has earned his PhD in history, and he has focused in his research on the American and Polish relationship in the interwar period. So we're glad to see you, and thank you for coming. Then on my right, we have, so to say, more academic points of view. First, we have Alexander Moens, who comes from Vancouver, Canada, and he is professor and chair of political science at Simon Fraser University. And he has been previously also visiting fellow of National Defense University in Washington, D.C., and also NATO Defense College in Rome. And he has quite many publications on NATO and not only. And we hope to have, so to say, comprehensive vision on the transatlantic link, as quite often it is, so to say, forgotten that there are two partners. Not only the United States ensuring the transatlantic link, but also Canada. Welcome. And last but not least, we have Sergei Markedono, Associate Professor of Russian State University for the Humanities, and he's also expert of the Russian International Affairs Council. And he's in his research activities, he has focused quite much on the situation in Caucasus, but also at the same time quite much on the general relationship between West and Russia. And so we expect quite a realistic perspective on how things are seen in Russia, so to say, not sometimes as wishful thinking as we hear, in the region that, things are, bad, that Russia is collapsing. So we are indeed looking forward to hear, so to say, a mainstream view. So thank you for coming, Sergei. But without any further delay, so let's start the discussion. So first of all, the speakers will give input statements, some 8 to 10 minutes, and then you, both watching us online on Delphi and also here, have the opportunity to ask questions or express comments. So let's start with Mr. Kaczorowicz. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much indeed, Mari. Since I'm an optimist generally, I think I ought to start with a pessimism first. Is there a military threat from Russia in the Baltic states? 30% of the population of Latvia do not believe that there is. And actually, they are probably right. But the point is whether we are talking about a military threat now at this moment or a potential threat in the future. And this is where we get into capabilities and intentions, military ones. Military capabilities take a very long time to build up. And since 2008, and what was a very unsuccessful military campaign in Georgia on the part of the Russian Federation, huge strides have been taken to improve that. And there is now, Russia is a regional superpower. There's no question about that. Particularly with its ability to project forces, strategic mobility, and of course A2AD, anti-access area denial. But this is where the other part of the equation comes in intention. I'm quite convinced that the first thing that President Putin thinks about when he wakes up in the morning is not about invading the Baltic states. On the other hand, intentions, if the capability is there, can change overnight, particularly if they have to change only in the mind of one person. And let me remind you that in March 2013, President Putin explained to the Russian Military Historical Society that the winter war of 39-40 against Finland was justified because it corrected a mistake made several decades earlier. And that is extremely worrying from our point of view. So, Warsaw Deterrence and Dialogue. NATO is about the kinetic, hard deterrence. We don't have time, or I won't have time, to talk about soft threats or indeed Article 3, which is self-defense, which is a critical part also of deterrence. But let me say a few words first about deterrence theory. People talk about deterrence by denial and deterrence by punishment. What do we mean? Well, by denial, That means having sufficient forces so that your enemy thinks that it may not be possible to succeed if they attack you. Well, let's look at geography. The combined land border between the Baltic states and Russia, Belarus, Kaliningrad is more than 1,500 kilometers. The land border between NATO and the Baltic states is a massive 104 kilometers, though I've heard other figures. In other words, a defense along the lines of the inner German border during the Cold War is not realistic. The RAND study of 2016 suggested that given the real state of affairs in 2016, to defend the Baltic states, we need 7 brigades here on the spot. I would suggest that Russia would quite reasonably consider that indeed to be provocative, unnecessary, and would undoubtedly take countermeasures, because that would be seen as a threat to St. Petersburg and possibly even to Moscow. Therefore, the calculus would immediately, on the deployment of these imaginary 7 brigades, would be out of kilter. What about punishment? Would the West go to war for the Baltic states if we were suddenly occupied? Well, this is where I believe we go wrong, because we have this false dichotomy between denial and punishment. The whole point of deterrence is to deter, and if you get to denial or punishment, deterrence has failed. And that's why it is important to look at ways to strengthen the deterrence, because it has worked in the past. There is no way that 3 light infantry brigades would have been able to defend Berlin during the Cold War. Yet Berlin was never seriously militarily threatened after the blockade. As far as conventional deterrence goes, I will now turn to EFP. Why is EFP so very good? Well, at the last count, I think I've got it right that there are 25 nations out of 29 which are involved in EFP, or as you could say, have skin in the game. In other words, in 2014, if Russia had invaded for some whatever reason the Baltic states, the 3 Baltic states would have run to Brussels and said, please, please, we've got a problem, come and help. And it's quite possible some of our partners would have said, well, we have to look at all the factors. We don't know exactly what brought this on. After all, you discriminate against your Russian minorities and so on and so forth. That is very different now. There are, including the Baltic states and Poland, 25 votes there already before we even start. Countries which see what is going on and cannot be out of it. And that, to my mind, makes the cost-gain calculus on any potential aggressor completely different. Of course, US engagement is central. We must retain that. And of course, EFP is not complete. There are big gaps in the air defense, sea components, and indeed our ability to reinforce credibly and quickly. But all of that is being thought about. Europe certainly must pull its weight, militarily and with a high-end capability. Now, last couple of minutes I'll talk about dialogue. Dialogue means that both sides have got to want to talk. And the NATO-Russia Council sessions do not really suggest that there's much desire to do that. Also, dialogue will only work if both parties feel relatively secure, i.e. from a position of strength. What I've said about EFP means that we in the West are relatively secure, and therefore it's important. Why is it important to Latvia? Well, no matter how hard we try or wish, we're never going to be able to change places with Iceland, and I don't think their climate would suit us quite as well as our topography and climate here. Therefore, Russia will forever be our neighbor. We want that neighbor to be a friendly neighbor. We want to have good relations with that neighbor. But that does not mean that we have to accept all of the things which the neighbor does, which are against the rules of the international order. Why are the two things together, deterrence and dialogue? Well, for the same sort of reasons why Rand came up with 7 brigades that were needed to defend the Baltic states. That is an entirely correct military technical answer to a given problem. But that's not what it's about. All of strategic theory talks about what the purpose is. And the purpose is not to go and invade a couple of countries or take some land. It is to achieve a political purpose. And therefore, we need to be looking at how to deter that political purpose. That is the main thing. Finally, I think nobody could say better than Publius Flavius in the 4th or 5th century when he wrote Civis pacem para bellum. If you want peace, prepare for war. And I'll stop there for the moment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kozhotzench, for this very comprehensive political and military assessment of the situation. I'm sure we'll come back to some of the issues you raised. Now I would welcome to give the floor to Mr. Vinit for the perspective from Poland.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And congratulations to organizers of this conference. The timing is absolutely perfect because we are basically 3 weeks before the NATO summit, well, next year we will have the anniversary, 70 years of NATO, which is a great occasion to prove once again that NATO is a defense alliance, one of the most successful alliances in the history of mankind. The alliance which was able to prevent and to defend its members through all these years. So all such debates, all such dialogue is of crucial importance to prepare the summit and decisions which will be taken during the summit or after the summit, but decisions which will have a very important influence on the security in the area, in the Baltic states, in the Eastern Europe, Central Europe, and so on. So this is why we believe that this is the best way actually to go forward and achieve success during the summit. Talking about NATO-Russia relations. Well, as you said, it was my privilege to serve in NATO from 2007 till 2011, together with a great friend Yanis Eichmanis, who is here, great ambassador of Latvia to NATO. But I think Yanis can agree that this was different era. This was like 6-7 years ago, but we were living like in different world. Well, the NATO-Russia relations are based on some fundamental documents. One of the most important one is the NATO-Russia Founding Act of 1997 on mutual relations, cooperation and security. And this document was followed in 2002 by the Rome Declaration. And we believe that these two documents creates kind of a backbone of the cooperation between NATO and Russia and the ideas which were included in these documents. So, well, initially the cooperation was going with some problems, but well. There were several programs which were joint programs with NATO and Russia. Please remember that, for example, NATO was helping to relocate some Russian officers, providing financial or housing opportunities. There were now it's quite like a joke, but there were programs on cooperation on chemical and biological weapons and detection of the airports, for example, which has completely new meaning in the current world. Well, there were more mill-to-mill cooperation in the sense of more openness and exchange of information about for example, exercises. But well, and of course there was area of cooperation concerning Afghanistan. Those years were now Afghanistan is somehow in the shadow, but this year, this was the key operation, ISAF operation in Afghanistan. And again, with transportation and logistics cooperation with Russian partners work quite well. Well, but then unfortunately the things start to change. And as you mentioned, one of the key elements was the invasion of Georgia in 2008, which created a lot of question marks and began the debate how we understand the basic values, how we understand international rule of law, how we understand that countries should not violate territory, sovereignty, rights of different countries. So this was the first moment when deterioration was visible, and then of course 2014 and the Ukrainian crisis, the invasion on Crimea and war in Donbas changed the situation completely. Well, there was a break in NATO-Russia Council operations from 2014 till 2016. The meetings resumed in 2016. There were 3 NATO-Russia Council meetings in 2016. There were another 3 meetings in 2017. We had one in 2018. There was a meeting between commanding officers in Baku, actually, in April this year. General Skapriotti met with Valery Gerasimov. So the contacts were reopened, but as it was agreed during the Warsaw Summit in Poland, in Warsaw, in 2016, we should work on one hand, remember about defense and deterrence, and another on the dialogue. And again, when we talk about the dialogue, we in Poland believe that the dialogue should be based on the reciprocal basis. And we should, both sides of the dialogue should respect rules of international legal system. Everybody should recognize that we should not change borders using force. Very basic ideas, very basic principles. President Duda highlighted this during his speech in the United Nations on 17 May, just recently, when Poland was leading the Security Council on this subject. And this view is quite universal in Central and Eastern Europe. Mr. President, you were able to, you participated in the Bucharest 9 meeting in Warsaw just a week ago. And I would like to highlight the importance of the joint declaration, which was adopted just a week ago in Warsaw, just a couple of days in Warsaw. And this declaration again highlight that we are very much for dialogue, but the dialogue must be based on rules, and the dialogue must be based on common understanding of the international principles and kind of basic understanding of rule of law. So with this idea, we are going to NATO summit in Brussels in 3 weeks from now. Maybe one more sentence about security situation in the context of NRC. One of the basic of this activity was exchange of information about different exercises. And we absolutely understand that military must exercise. This is one of the principles. But this is important that we will go to the situation which was some years ago when there were honest and open exchange of information, that countries were informing about the exercises without any tricks or dividing the exercises into several parts to avoid reporting and so on and so on. We had such exchange of information in 2016-17, but again, this should be based on reciprocal approach. NATO is open to inform our Russian partners, but we expect the same from the other side to get more concrete information comparable to ours about Zapad in 2017 or Vostok in 2018. And I think our briefings on the different Trident exercises can be example how NATO is open for cooperation, but again, our openness must be based on reciprocity. Let me conclude with another aspect, which is not exactly NATO, but we believe is of key importance, and this is cooperation in the framework of OSCE in Vienna. OSCE in Vienna was playing extremely important role in the past, and there were some important documents and cooperation agreements, cooperation vehicles like Open Sky Treaty, CFE Treaty. We believe that we are very sorry that our Russian partners withdrew from this cooperation, because OSCE Vienna is probably the best platform to have more deeper mill-to-mill exchange. So we don't see any reason why we should not continue this angle of cooperation. Let me conclude here, and I'm open for question and further dialogue. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm sure there will be questions. Thank you very much for giving this overview, historical and contemporary perspective. But now let's get a position from the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. Mr. Moyens from Vancouver, Canada. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Very happy to be here. I wear two hats, which is very common in Europe. One hat is as a researcher, also with the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, a Canadian think tank. And the other hat is that I'm the director of a NATO field school and simulation program, whereby we are training Canadian third and fourth year students about what the military is, what defense policy is, what multilateralism is. Maybe you think, why are you doing that? Well, I can assure you that in the western half of Canada, at least, Canadian youth do not think about military things at all. They worry about climate change and other important things, but the military is off the scale, which is very dangerous, especially as we realize what is happening in certain other parts of the world. I want to present to you brief points about my research, which is the relationship of NATO and Russia. And I'd like to present a few brief points on both sides, kind of like two pillars coming down, and with some areas of comparison and concern. First of all, we started in this research project with the so-called broken promise of no NATO enlargement. Well, that argument should now be completely filed away into the nonsense folder, because there was no promise given to Mikhail Gorbachev that NATO would not enlarge. It can be very clearly shown. Secondly, we need to realize that what happened in NATO is essentially, in terms of enlargement in the late 90s and in the 2000s, what happened was NATO enlargement light. NATO did not move stationed forces out east. NATO made declarations about no nuclear weapons. NATO kept its tactical nuclear weapons to less than 200 because most nations weren't interested in spending money, and most nations thought that the role of nuclear weapons could fade away. So the idea that NATO over the last 20 years has been a growing threat to Russia, we want to examine this and find what kind of objective information exists. The enhanced forward presence activity by NATO is very, very useful and very helpful, but I think we must be careful not to think of it as an end goal. Because the concept that we hear sometimes in the literature as well as among officials, the concept of strategic deterrence, that all you have to do is you have to do a little bit, and that gives you deterrence at the strategic level, I think creates a great vulnerability. Namely, if at the tactical level you do not have the same components of the deterrence, then you may in fact create an opportunity to test NATO's strength in terms of its decision-making coherence. So I think what is really necessary in the coming years, and I'm hoping this current NATO summit will move in that direction, is to create a type of NATO normal in Central and Eastern Europe. The way NATO was, in a way, positioned during the Cold War in more Western parts of Europe. Canada's leadership in the Enhanced Forward Presence battle group is an important one, even though our numbers are modest. One of the key things we do is we help build NATO interoperability at the tactical level. We have the largest amount of NATO nations, 8 this week, and we have tremendous challenges of having NATO components from different nations work together. But the Canadians are using their natural skills, I would dare to say, as well as their long experience of, in a friendly and constructive manner, bringing nations together to learn how to prepare, to work together. I think this is a great value both for Canada and for the alliance. Eventually, NATO needs to come to a new position which could be called by one famous analyst as peace through legitimate strength. Peace through legitimate strength. And we must be very cautious about 2 political things. The first is on the North American side, namely the growing gap between the top political policy and political statements on the one hand, and the actual activity of North American nations on the other hand. That gap is growing, and that creates tremendous vulnerability. That's on the North American side. I would say on the European side, I would say as a North American that it's always useful, always important to work on European Union capacity, European Union initiatives, but let us not forget a key lesson of NATO for many years and operations. Without unified command, you cannot have unified action. So if you're going in the European Union to replace the unified command that is formed under SACEUR with something that isn't in fact is not unified, which you can think of as the equivalent of Schengen or the Euro, where you had something that looked unified but wasn't unified, you create on the military side a fatal vulnerability. On the Russian side, our research is looking at the nature of Russian governance and what it means in the long term for the needs of Russian people. And our concerns are growing that in Moscow, a type of mobilizational authoritarianism is now the construct of Russian governance, and that this is not in Russia's people's long-term interest. The key threat to the Russian governance structure remains the demonstration effect of Western liberalism. If that becomes something that increasing numbers of Russian elites and other people want in Russia, that is the fundamental threat to the governance of Russia. There is no military threat to Russia from NATO. There only is a political threat. Russia we examine as conducting a 2-level policy. One level is a defender, in quotation marks, defender, protector at home, and the other level is what we see as creating risk abroad. So at the same time, there is the communication of stability protection at home, and on the other hand, there is actual creation of instability at home. We see the Russian government defining respect essentially as a negative thing, that respect ought to mean fear. Respect is something that then, ironically, repels. That kind of respect does not attract, but it repels. So the type of respect that this governance structure is creating internationally is actually not in the needs, in the interests of the Russian people in the long run. We believe in our research so far that the Russian actions may well cause them to take greater risks. And therefore, the need for NATO, both resilience at a conventional defense level and resilience in terms of information war and resilience in terms of cyber war are absolutely necessary so that the conditions of a dialogue can be formed in the long run. But in our comparison with the Harmel report and today, we would argue that at this point in time, the conditions are not good for a dualistic policy where you have both defense and détente. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor, for providing the North American perspective. And now it's time to hear how things look like from Russia, Moscow, because we have heard quite many versions, and so the floor is yours, Ms. Markedonov, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the floor. First of all, let me express my gratitude to you personally and to the organizers in general for inviting me here. I understand and you understand my viewpoint will contradict to the mainstream in this audience. It's understandable, more or less. And I'm grateful for your thesis on wishful thinking as an obstacle to understand the reasons behind the Russian behavior on the foreign policy arena. But let me stop with the lyrics and to pay attention to the substantive ideas concerning the Russian-NATO relations. Of course, I'm so puzzled because a lot of questions were raised here, and in order to cover all of them, maybe a monograph is required, but I have a lack of the time. First idea, most of speakers discussing the NATO-Russia relations today start with Crimea in 2014. I am engaged in the discussions and exchange of views between Westerners and Russians. And sometimes it seems to me we discovered the new historical era started since 2014. It's not true, of course, because this situation happened not accidentally. A lot of roots, prerequisites existed before. As for Russian-NATO relations, they survived through ups and downs after the USSR collapse and the end of the Cold War. But this crisis is not the first one. Some of them mentioned Georgian war, Russo-Georgia war, but forgetting completely that Georgia didn't control effectively Abkhazia and South Ossetia since 1992-1993. Establishment of the de facto state was a direct result of ethno-nationalism in Georgia and attempts to restore the control over those territories. It was a result of ethno-political conflicts. Georgia a lot of times violated Dagamis agreement between 2004 and 2008. It initiated unfreezing of the conflict and so on details. It's necessary to understand it. The first crisis in relations between NATO and Russia took place in 1998 in Kosovo. It was Russia's initiative that time. In the two consequent crises of 2008 and 2014, it was initiative on the NATO side, but it tells us that this crisis is not something new. We could speak about systemic problem. And second mistake, crucial mistake made by the Western observers is restriction of Russian motivation by personality of one figure, Vladimir Putin, of course, and authoritarianism in Russia. Excuse me, but Russia was not satisfied by NATO enlargement since the first day of this process in 1994. I wish to remind you the speech of President Yeltsin in OSCE Budapest summit in 1994 December. Vladimir Putin at that time was not so known person. He was more or less modest official in St. Petersburg mayor office. But Yeltsin at that time said about a cold peace replacing Cold War. Even Anatoly Chubais, iconic figure of Russian liberals and reformers in 1997, said that NATO enlargement was the biggest mistake of the West. This is why it's kind of consensus. Russia was not satisfied by the new environment after the end of the Cold War and the end of the USSR, because Russian foreign policy has been shaped basing on two impressions, two perceptions, two collapses. The collapse of the USSR and transformation of post-Soviet space, because this process as a historical one is not finished. Judicially, yes, but historically, no, because it was easy to proclaim independent Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, but it was harder to establish sustainable identities. Because not all people in newly independent countries were happy to be citizens of newly independent countries, like Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh, like Abkhaz people in Georgia, or Russian people in Crimea. It's not bad, it's not good. It's necessary to understand. In the post-Soviet space, we had splitted societies. And as for NATO and Westerners, what's the root of the Russian fear of NATO? Of course, it's not about attacks from the NATO side on Russia. Of course, no. It's kind of artificial problem to be discussed. The problem is instrumental approach of newly independent elites. They attempt to use NATO like the instrument to push Russia away from areas which have interest to Russia. As for NATO, don't portray this organization like NGO, human rights organization, or organization of collectors of steppe. It's military bloc, by the way. Military bloc enlarged in terms of number, in terms of cases, more than in the period of Cold War. I try to make exercises with my students, and I ask them about number of NATO in the period of Cold War and after, and they usually said in the period of Cold War enlargement, there were more enlargement than after. No. The other point about use of force. NATO as a bloc used force not in the period of Cold War. In personal capacity, US did it in Vietnam or Great Britain in Falkland crisis, but not as a bloc. What's about Bosnia? What's about Kosovo? You said that Crimea was the unique case of change or reconsider for international borders. Not true. As for intervention, Balkans, recognition, very fast recognition of independence of Croatia, Slovenia, support of different groups in splitted society. This practice was not discovered by Russia. It's not justification, it's, how to say, the step to overcome the oversimplification. Now a lot of my colleagues from the West like to quote Paris Charter of New Europe, adopted in November 1990. They said about great gap in values between Russia and European Union, or Europe in general. But what's about NATO in this charter? The other interesting exercise to my student, how many times was NATO mentioned in this document? Zero. Zero, because new Europe was perceived like Europe with no military blocs, military competitions, and so on. One interesting question raised by my predecessor about a broken promise to Russia. He's absolutely right and absolutely wrong at the same time. Yes, NATO as an organization, as an institution, didn't promise nothing. Anything, sorry for my English. Anything to Russia. But I'm a historian by my basic education, and I read, of course, newly discovered sources from the American National Archive about negotiations on the unification of Germany. American diplomats in their personal capacity promised it. It's necessary also to take into the account. It's necessary also to take into the account high level of expectations on the Soviet side, interest of the Soviets and Gorbachev to stop hostility. And maybe he made some wrong steps. I'm not so critical to him. It's necessary to understand realities of the late 80s, early 90s. They were different from nowadays. A lot of expectations appeared at times. But those promises from the side of James Baker were done. It's also necessary to understand because new thinking proposed by Gorbachev and his team was not about NATO enlargement. It was about new Europe with no blocks and so on, and no intervention to areas interesting for Russia. Because now the most of our dialogues with Westerners are about, how to say, punishment of Russia or pushing Russia to do this or that. It's not a kind of productive dialogue, I suppose. I am not so naive to believe now I will push you to share my viewpoint or official viewpoint of Russia, to accept this viewpoint, but it's necessary to understand this narrative, Russian concerns, because they have equal status to the NATO ones, or status of expectations or perceptions of NATO country members. Because many people say, Georgia has its own choice to do this, this, and this. Yes, of course. But Abkhaz people also, and Russia also. Russia can disagree with this choice, because this choice is not only sovereign choice. It concerns neighbors. We are all on board, as Mikhail Gorbachev said in 1990. We all live in the yellow submarine. Maybe not yellow, blue, no matter. It's necessary to understand that the decision of Georgia to do this can contradict to core Russian interests. Realities of peacekeeping operation in South Ossetia and Abkhazia, interest of minorities and so on, because it's also interesting for me that most of Europeans are very careful to issues of minorities. What's about Abkhaz people, Armenians in Karabakh, South Ossets, Russians in Crimea? Yeah, I can agree, I'm not official. I can agree that Georgia is territorially integral country. Okay, no problem for me to proclaim it, as well as territorial integrity of Ukraine. But in this case, we should do the next step. Recognize that not whole Georgia, not whole Ukraine is in favor of NATO. Even now, after Crimea, after Donbass, sociological polls demonstrate that only 55, 54, 50% of Ukrainians are in favor of NATO. About 35, 40% are not in favor, even now. After war in Donbass, after Crimea, even now. It's also necessary to understand, because we have to deal with real environment, real people, not people living in their textbooks and some reports. This is why, coming back to the problem of dialogue and perspective, I am a clear supporter of the dialogue. But for me, not only as a Russian, but as an expert, first of all, my passport is not the matter, by the way, and fairy tales talking to my kids. Estimates are more important. And as for expert, I understand that key problem here is cost of this dialogue. And don't have any illusions that a successor of Vladimir Putin would be a wishful thinking person who will stop any Russian activities abroad and so on, so on. Please be careful reading Alexei Navalny and his writings, interviews on Moldova, by the way. A couple of weeks ago, he made an interview and said that Transnistria is not a part of Moldova. Now Navalny is nobody. He's not even deputy of minister or governor. This is why there are points of consensus, and NATO enlargement and no engagement of Russia in these security things is a kind of consensus of Russia. Because one more point, last not the least, 1 minute. A lot of times people raise the question on a NATO-Russia council. It was a good idea, but this council looked like 25 or 20 against Russia. It was not taken into the account Russian reasons in the process of practical decision making. For Russia, this point is crucially important, not official presence in official ceremonies. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the perspective from Russia. And now we are ready to receive your questions or comments. And there are microphones in the back, and I see hand raised in the front row. So, and please introduce yourself and whom are you addressing the question? And we will get there are several questions if there will be, and then we will respond them altogether.
Thank you. I'm Sensako from ICDS in Tallinn. It's not a question but a comment, because the last speaker was talking about what was promised to Gorbachev and what was not. So let's turn to a main person, Gorbachev himself. In his interview in October 2014, he said the following, I quote, so Gorbachev is talking, the topic of NATO expansion was not discussed at all, and it wasn't brought up in these years. I say this with full responsibility. Not a single Eastern European country raised the issue, not even a Warsaw Pact ceased to exist in 1991. Western leaders didn't bring it up either. Another issue was brought up. It was discussed, making sure that NATO's military structure would not advance and additional forces would not be deployed to the former Eastern Europe. Baker's statement mentioned in your question to the interviewer was made in that context. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much for the comment. So I see hand in the third row, so please.
Alisa Podolak, Embassy of Ukraine. Thank you, panelists, for your contribution, and I want to comment on some figures which were given by the Russian representative, in particular regarding the dissatisfaction of Russian people in Crimea. I want to remind that the majority of Ukraine in 1991, including in Crimea, voted for the independence of Ukraine. And regarding the support of NATO in Ukraine, due to your aggression in Ukraine, this support grew very fast and very enormously. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much for the comment from Ukraine. I see also Mr. Eichmann, ambassador, who was also mentioned by a Polish speaker. Please.
Yes. This may be a bit of a Monty Python question.
Mm-hmm.
Bear with me. And that is, how do you solve the duck-rabbit problem? If you go on the internet and you look up Ludwig Wittgenstein, and you will see that he made a drawing, one drawing, so it's one piece of information. But I see the drawing as a duck, and you see the drawing as a rabbit. And it seems to me that what we have here is a duck and rabbit problem. The same pieces of information are interpreted in two different ways. And I think the dialogue that you were all speaking about has to recognize that everybody, in terms of NATO, has a duck-rabbit problem. And how do you overcome the duck-rabbit problem? I just don't know.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for your comment and question. Are there any more questions in the room? So I don't see any at the moment, and let's start the answers. And I would propose that I would also, add some questions on top of what was heard. And I would like to start this time in the reverse order with Professor Marchedono. And so there were some comments. You'll be free to, so to say, also express your opinion, what was heard, but about the future of Russia. So you said that, who knows who is going to be the next president, but anyway, that he's going to follow the same policy. So do you know who is going to be the next president of Russia?
Okay. Now, at this moment, I don't know who will be the next president of Russia. I'm not sure that now it's kind of so a topical issue, especially in terms of the domestic developments. But one comment, very important in this audience. Speaking about Vladimir Putin, many people try to focus on the problem, who is Mr. Putin? I suppose that other question, why is Mr. Putin, is more topical and interesting. Because we should not criticize this personality, we should understand why was this person requested in Russia. Not so stupid country, by the way, country with rich history and so on. The same question could be addressed also to Georgia, why was Mr. Saakashvili and why was Mr. Poroshenko. I don't agree with a lot of my compatriots who connect appearance of Saakashvili or Poroshenko with Western conspiracies. Of course, it's not true. it's necessary also to understand. The same is with Putin. Because people survived difficulties of 90s, economic difficulties, social disasters, disorientation, frustration, and so on, so on. Chose him and even now tend to, how to say, to consider him like the best option or maybe best among the worst options. It's necessary to understand. But the domestic agenda in how to say, public opinion is differentiated from the foreign policy agenda. It's not only Russian know-how. I know a lot of persons in Georgia who hated Saakashvili, but at the same time, on the question to whom does Abkhazia belong, they answered absolutely in one way, to Georgia. This is why it's not know-how of Russia. Coming back to the figures on Ukraine, first of all, you should know as an intellectual person the rules of sociology. Public opinion changes. As for Crimea, in 1991, only 55% of people in Crimea, 54. I remember data. As for Donbass, the figure was different, 78% in Donetsk, 82% in Lugansk. In Crimea, 54% voted for independence of Ukraine. But we should also ask the second question. What did they mean speaking or thinking about independence? I brilliantly remember one interview of coal miner from Donbass about independence. He answered, can I say or answer in Russian or mixture of Russian and Ukrainian, you understand? Мне все равно, как будет это называться, колбаса или ковбаса, главное, чтоб она была. It's clear, understandable. It was not about, how to say, desire to be really independent and so on and so on. By the way, speaking about Russian people in the capitals, 50% of Muscovites voted in March 1999 against the USSR. 50% of Muscovites. About 35% of people in St. Petersburg, then Leningrad, voted against USSR. It's also necessary to understand the clear changes of public opinion. Of course, you know the story of Yuri Meshkov on the 1994, clashes between Kiev and Moscow, and other approach of Leonid Kuchma, which was more flexible, much more flexible than approach of new guys came to power after the second Maidan. A lot of difficult questions. And of course, we can remember the experience of 2008, where a lot of regional legislations voted for supporting Abkhazia, South Ossetia, Konovalyuk Commission and his investigation of arms deal between Tbilisi and Kiev, a lot of things. It's not coincidence I said that this topic requires a monograph, by the way. This topic is not only about Russian intervention. This topic is also about identity in Ukraine. Don't forget that prior to the Crimean crisis, 19,000 Ukrainian troops were deployed in the peninsula. 12,000 of them replaced their loyalty in favor of Russia, including Commander-in-Chief of Ukrainian navies, Mr. Berezovsky. Now he serves in the Black Sea Fleet. Frankly speaking, I don't consider this step as the brilliant, by the way, because I don't rely to traitors, but in my personal capacity, of course. But nevertheless, it's a fact. Your guy, Anton Gerashchenko, said about 40,000 traitors in Ministry of Interior in Ukraine. Your guys with Ukrainian passports who changed their loyalty. Mayor like Nelly Stepa, who greeted Mr. Strelkov in Slaviansk. Okay, I know Slaviansk, by the way.
Okay,
yeah.
So thank you very much for the...
Okay, only one idea, because maybe in this audience I am the only person who really was in Donbass, because I was born in Rostov-on-Don. This is why my first trip to Donetsk took place at the age of 3.5 years. My first trip to Moscow took place at the age of 13. This is why I know in details a lot of things.
Thank you very much. Now let's turn to Canada. So much has been said, but also may I also add a question?
Yes,
so you mentioned that at least in the Western Canada, so people do not care much about the military. So it's more about climate and, so to say, soft security issues. And maybe you could also comment on how the situation with Russia is perceived in Canada. So is it seen as an adversary, or what is the situation and what can we expect in future from Canada?
Yes, thank you. I have 4 very brief points, so let me know if I go too long. The duck and rabbit problem. There is, of course, no solution except if all may speak the truth, then all can decide whether it's a duck or a rabbit. For example, Winston Churchill, enormously successful hero of World War II. But a few months later, the English people said, I'm now worried about bread, and I don't worry now about winning World War II, and I vote him out, and I vote somebody else in. If Russia had that opportunity, that would be an interesting step towards learning the duck versus the rabbit. I don't want to belabor the broken promises too much, except to apply the duck and rabbit lesson for 2 more minutes. Jim Baker is a Texas lawyer. He's negotiating with Gorbachev in early February 1990 about getting some 200,000 plus Soviet troops out of East Germany. So he says, you know, let's put this on the table maybe, you know, NATO doesn't go much further, or maybe it's something we need to talk about. His people brief Helmut Kohl, who meets Gorbachev 2 days later. And Kohl, who's very interested in German unification and getting Soviet soldiers out, he makes it a little stronger. He says, you know, I would be prepared to have this as an item in the 2+4 talks. Okay? Now comes the Monday morning National Security Council meeting in Washington. Papa Bush, George Herbert Walker Bush. The Baker negotiations are discussed, and Bush says absolutely not. It's not on the table. If we put that on the table, we will essentially say that Russia will have its own type of Yalta II sooner or later. We can't do that. We have international obligations in the CSCE, in international law, for sovereign states to be able to apply for membership in these organizations. We cannot a priori, by international law, remove that legal right. Number 3, I think in our project what we're trying to do is not guess who will succeed Vladimir Putin, but to try to understand what failed in the 1990s, why were there no gains made in building institutions, movements towards the rule of law, constitutionality, independent judiciary, independent press. Why were those little attempts not more successful? Because Russia is going to need institutions, real institutions and real rule of law to become a state that can serve the interests of its people over the long run. Soft security, the last point. This is a big concern to me because Canadians, we are also neighbors of Russia, although it's across the Arctic and soon it will be an Arctic Sea. We are also neighbors of Russia, but Canadians do not think about Russia. They do not think systematically about Russia. Now, maybe that's a good thing, I don't know, because once they start thinking about it, they may share some of the concerns in this room. But at the same time, Canadians are moving, like everybody else, into a new world of great power politics, and they must be aware of the interests, threats, and opportunities out there, and it's a great need to educate them.
Thank you very much again for the North American perspective. Now let's move on back to Poland, and if I also can, add a question on top of what has been said already. So recently has been reported that Poland proposes the United States to pay for permanent presence of US troops on the soil on Poland, and I guess quite many people would be interested to find out more about this issue.
Okay, I will go to this question at the end, but following the professor's example, I would also like to highlight 4 points, maybe 2 more historical and 2 current one. With the 1997 enlargement of NATO, I was then a junior diplomat, and I still do remember this was kind of a glory days. But what I was going to say, that each and every nation, no matter small or big or medium, has a right to choose its own alliance. This is very basic rule, and this is what always what we followed in our foreign policy, that Poland, we had different history. Each and every country in Central and Eastern Europe had different history. There were some similarities, there were differences, but no matter big or small, this nation, this country should be able to choose the alliance, and we choose to join the NATO alliance. This was the first point, and maybe one just small comment to Sergei comments about Yeltsin. We do remember that he visited Warsaw in 1993, and after long conversation with our president Lech Wałęsa, he actually endorsed our membership in NATO. So there were different points in the Russian position here. But again, this is just a footnote. Each and every nation is free to choose its alliance. Now coming to the current situation, defense, deterrence, and dialogue. As I mentioned in my speech, this is the way how we see the situation. But in this framework, in defense and deterrence, the relation between individual members of NATO is of key importance, and we are very happy that our relation with our Latvian friends are so good, and we are very proud that our forces are able to train and to be part of the defense and deterrence here in Latvia. So let me highlight the role of 9th Armored Cavalry Brigade, the commanding officer, Major Leszek Woźny, who is here. Thank you for your role. You are fulfilling the great example of Polish-Latvian cooperation, and let me remind you that it was actually began in January 1920. In January 1920, our units helped to liberate Dyneburg, and again, this was first time we used armored forces. Polish tanks actually played some role in this endeavor, and now we are on the good track to continue this. And on the bilateral relation, we hope that equally good relation between Poland and NATO will be both in NATO and the EU, and there are some place to improvement. Now, on the basis, this is not that Poland was going to pay anyone for deployment. When you know this from the Latvian perspective, when you host foreign troops, NATO or allied forces, there's a question about infrastructure. There's a question about roads, transportation, airfields. There are questions about school, creating facilities to host the bases. There are always costs, and we cannot say that these costs do not exist. So this is when we in NATO discuss right now, preparing for the summit, new command and control system, new command structure system. This is important that we presented what Poland can offer in this kind of infrastructural help. Of course, I understand that there are NATO infrastructure projects done through NCIP programs, but still NCIP programs are divided among all NATO countries. So we have big NCIP programs in Italy, in Spain, in Turkey, quite little such programs actually in our part of Europe. So when we have lack of these NCIP programs in our part, it is important that we will support these programs through our national budget. And this is how we looked at the whole process, how to create environment, better environment for joint training, joint presence, joint exercise, joint NATO installation in the host country territories. There's question of schools, shops, and so a lot of kind of a daily operation. Also proving grounds, place where troops can train. There are a lot of restrictions, and these restrictions sometimes make it difficult actually to train in the proper way. So again, preparing this kind of environment, if I could say, plays a key role. So this is how we look at the whole process. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. But just a quick follow-up question. So how realistic would it be that Poland accomplish, let's say, permanent American presence in Poland? Because this is what has been reported.
This depends how we understand permanent presence, because we already have American units in Poland, and there are several of those with, for example, with air component. We have American officers in JFTC Bydgoszcz. We have American troops in Szczecin, in Elbląg. So there are in Orzysz. So there are several units which are training, which are rotating. But we understand that this actually depends on the results of the summit and debate among CHOTS, and the debate among defense ministers and the head of state and governments during the summit and after the summit. Because most likely during the summit we will have decision about the logistical arrangements, new logistical comments. Other structures probably will be decided after the summit. So we look at this as a kind of a process. And we will see how this will go. Maybe one more sentence. We in Poland, we very much agree with the sentence that NATO should be 360 orientation. So we are not looking only at Central and Eastern Europe, we are looking also at the South. And this is how we understand the NATO solidarity. That we understand the solidarity threats to the southern neighbors, and the southern neighbors do understand our concerns. So this is the kind of a basic rule of NATO, and this is how we try to fulfill. This is why our officers, our units are serving in, for example, in Italy and in other NATO installations in the whole NATO territory.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Ambassador. Mr. Kaczorzyński.
Let me start with Ambassador Eichmannis. I'm sorry to say, but Wittgenstein's duck rabbit drawing in this case is in fact a red herring, because we are not talking about somebody's drawing. We're talking about either a real duck or a real rabbit. Either your underage daughter is pregnant or she is not. There's no in between. Either a book shot down MH17 or something else shot it down, and it's no good pretending that, oh, well, it could have been a Ukrainian fighter of some sort, or many, many other disinformation ideas which have come since that particular incident there. And this is where we get down to the information war, and we are in a situation where the so-called Russenversteher, and there are people who try to see the other side. That's always been the problem with centrists and liberals. It's actually a very, very good thing, but trying to see the other side too hard takes you into what is in effect Stockholm Syndrome, and you start to believe things which are not true because that improves your relationship with those with whom you're talking. That is not the sort of dialogue which will be successful with Russia. Russians, I am sure that our colleague will agree, are very pragmatic people. It is best to talk to them honestly and truthfully, because that's the only way we will get to an answer. Second point, why if NATO is not a threat to Russia, why Zapad exercises? The Zapad exercises, the last three, have been a dress rehearsal of finding out how the Baltic states could be invaded and cut off from Western support. It's not really not necessary, but if you demonstrate a capability in such a very obvious way, well, inevitably those you're demonstrating it to will either feel intimidated or will try to do something to make sure that there is not going to be a threat. The last point I want to make, and that is that between the eastern border of NATO and the European Union and the western border of the Russian Federation, there are 6 states of 8 altogether, something in the order of 82 million people. I believe that all of those people have the same right to choose their own political system, economic system, security system as everyone in the 3 Baltic states. They have that right because they are free people. And anyone who says, well, this interferes with our interests because we live next to them, and we heard that argument about spheres of interest, that is not the way that we in the European Union and NATO want to see the world, which is why we are protecting it, which is also why we have EFP, which is why we must maintain dialogue with Russia, and why we are not prepared to see another Yalta. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And as we have like some 5 minutes, may I ask all speakers in 1 minute to give, so to say, their vision, NATO and Russia in 10 years. So where will it be? Or if not, then what should we do with Russia and NATO, with the relationship? Can we start with Mr. Kazartinch?
Yes. I think that in 10 years' time, our focus will not be on NATO-Russia. I think we will probably have stabilized one way or another. And I don't mean that means that President Putin or his successor think quite differently. I think we can have a stable relationship anyway. I think we are going to be looking very much towards the Asia-Pacific area, because I think the problems which are building up there are enormous. We've seen now in Singapore a very serious attempt to try to do something about them. Heaven help everybody who's involved with that, but history suggests that it really is not that simple, and that's only one part of a much, much bigger problem. The bases, Chinese bases in the South China Sea, I think all of these are going to come and haunt us in 10 years' time.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. And you know, it's also good to remember that at the time when G7 met in Canada, there was the Shanghai Cooperation Organization held a summit where Xi Jinping met Vladimir Putin and others. So the Far East is there, and definitely that will be more and more important issue. So we cannot forget about that. But again, NATO and Russia in 10 years, Mr. Vidit, how things.
No, I agree with the comments that Far East will play more and more role, and also from the point of view of the Russian security. NATO is not a threat, as it was said. So most likely we will have kind of a status quo in Europe, but more and more attention will be paid to the Far East, but also to the Central Asia. We will see what will happen in Afghanistan. Afghanistan is important not only from perspective of Washington, Brussels, London, Paris, but Central Asia and Moscow either. And please remember what was happening in Afghanistan or in the Central Asia before 9/11, when actually Taliban were on the offensive. They were going north, creating instability in the Central Asian republics. So from this angle, NATO operation in Afghanistan was very helpful to Russia, stabilizing the situation. Of course, we hope that Afghanistan will be stable and there will be some kind of understanding and some kind of government. By the way, the current government is doing quite well, actually, after NATO. Most of the forces of NATO withdrew. We have right now only kind of a training forces in Afghanistan. So this will determine probably as I agree here, this situation in Far East, in Central Asia will determine what we are facing here in Eastern and Central Europe. But I think we will have this is kind of optimistic view that this will be status quo and maybe some improvements.
Thank you very much. So the last 2 minutes, Mr. Moyens, 10 years from now, how things would look like?
I think it's quite a realistic assessment that in either the year 2024 or 2025, the Chinese defense budget will overtake the American defense budget in spending. We know that the One Belt, One Road initiative ends in Europe. So the relationship between Russia and NATO could turn for the better if it were in China's interest, or it could turn for the worse. Be that as it may, NATO has shown since 1949 that when constitutional liberal democracies cooperate multilaterally, they have the greatest influence. And this is something that we must work on hard together. For example, if the Poles are going to work with the Americans on basing, in NATO often the basing and hosting agreements are bilateral anyways. So this could be very complementary to NATO, but let us not forget that the temptation in great power politics is for smaller states to go one-on-one in alliance with the bigger states. But the lessons of NATO is that is not the best way.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And last but not least, the forecast from Russia.
Thank you so much. I'm not so optimistic, frankly speaking, because I don't see any strategic perspectives shared by both Russia and NATO, but it doesn't mean we should not do anything to overcome the situation. What's about perspective? First of all, we should stop any discussions or artificial discussions on values and so on, because did Russia violate international law, intervened? Yes, of course, but the same was done by Americans. In Kosovo, a lot of violations, a lot of proofs of it, in the Balkans in general. And as for interventions, did United States take into the account interest of Serbs, for example, or Libyans or people in the Middle East? No, of course. This is why I stopped discussing it, because it would be kind of duel of accusations. It should be more productive to discuss interest. Of course, we can find a lot of common interests. Central Asia, Afghanistan, of course, Nagorno-Karabakh resolution, because the unfreezing of this conflict is also dangerous for Eurasia in general, Russia and NATO. Let's speak more about interest. And one absolutely last point in this panel. We face a very paradoxical perception. Many people in Central Eastern Europe hate Yalta and Potsdam and love Helsinki. It's kind of paradox, absolutely not understandable for me, because it's impossible to imagine Helsinki with no Yalta and Potsdam. Yalta and Potsdam established prerequisites for Helsinki. It was direct consequence of Yalta and Potsdam. This is why it should be more careful, following some interesting schemes, but not taking into account nuances and detail. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This is the time that we have to stop the first panel, so we'll continue at 11 o'clock with the second panel with the emerging challenges. And I would like you to join me in a round of applause for our speakers for their great contribution. Thank you.